huge story that goes to the heart of the potential obstruction case against Donald Trump, which is all about whether he committed a potential crime in office. Well, here's something brand new. James Comey's former deputy and former acting FBI director, Andrew McCabe, now suing the Trump administration and accusing Donald Trump of a, quote, unlawful termination, an illegal firing, and saying it was all part of Donald Trump's unconstitutional scheme. The news comes as Democrats step up the pressure in what I mentioned, the obstruction probe, with that new legal action that we were reporting on this week. Mueller's star witness, former counsel Don McGahn. Judiciary Committee has filed a new lawsuit of their own to press him for testimony, identifying McGahn as the most important fact witness in its consideration of whether to recommend, yes, articles of impeachment. Now, the court's decision on that could open the floodgates to many others who might be stonewalling the Congress and their impeachment probe or quasi-impeachment probe, depending on who you ask what it's called. Now, this lawsuit cites impeachment as an argument. Keep in mind, a majority now of the House Democratic Caucus backs an impeachment inquiry. Here's Chairman Nadler on the timeline.
Explicitly, the only emergency is the fact
articles of impeachment. We could get to that in the late fall, in the latter part of the year.
I'm joined now by former federal prosecutor John Flannery, counsel to 3 congressional investigations. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
As I've mentioned to viewers, there's obviously a lot going on. In a different week, this would be the biggest story in the world. A year ago, the person who literally was standing next to James Comey as the deputy in a firing that many folks saw as potential high crimes, now basically punching back and suing this administration. That's huge. Of course, there's a lot of other stuff going on. So with that context, that's sort of how I'm viewing it. What do you think is important in what Mr. McCabe is doing here? And is he taking a risk of his own because, you know, this drudges back up what the administration says was their critiques of him?
Well, I have a feeling that McCabe's on the right side of the fact pattern here. And the thing that excites me about it is how soon can we subpoena Mr. Trump as the person who's responsible for his firing as part of Trump's defense? So in a civil suit, we have a lot of precedents that say Trump is going to have to appear and testify. We have several civil cases. So I think that it's pretty exciting thought that you might get even more information. Somebody might finally get Trump in the hot seat over this matter. And
viewers, I think, who follow this story will remember it was not that Donald Trump had an issue with one person at the FBI or DOJ. This was a campaign by him to go after a bunch of different people for his reasons. And then you have a legal debate over whether those were lawful reasons or not. So reading from the new filing, again, this is brand new, we have the McCabe view, later to be tested in court, that Trump had an unconstitutional plan to discredit and remove DOJ and FBI employees who were deemed to be his partisan opponents because they were not, quote, politically loyal to him. If that is provable, I mean, you could write anything in a brief. If that's provable with evidence, is that acceptable for a sitting president?
Well, it's not acceptable behavior at all. I mean, it's really criminal. And luckily, we're going to have this civil discussion, and I think it's going to survive motions to dismiss, which are usually the threshold of a case, any case, including McCabe's case. So I think they'll be off to discovery. I wonder if they didn't serve discovery with the complaint. But I think that's going to be pretty exciting. We'll be following that. And it comes at a time when Congress is planning a fall ramming speed campaign to fire Trump. And I think that they finally laid out a plan of action, and I'm sure it coincides with the success of the understated Mueller appearance. And people don't consider the fact that I think back in March, 420 members of Congress actually approved this investigation in a House resolution.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, all of this is related because it goes back to whether in the light warmest to the president, he just was a rookie who didn't know what he's doing and just didn't like James Comey. And people may disagree with that management style, but that's not a high crime. Versus what you just laid out that the Congress is looking at and that this filing says, which is an allegation that the president systematically tried to clean house for political reasons over law and order, which is literally an impeachable offense if you can prove it. Mr. Flannery, thank you for stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.